In this slide, we can appreciate the different production possibility frontier for country A and for country B. So we assume that country A is relatively capital abundant, so it has a lot of capital and relatively less labor compared to country B. And as a consequence, B is relatively labor abundant. At the same time, we're assuming that soybeans in production to be produced use a lot of capital and not very much labor, while textiles are the opposite. They are relatively labor intensive, meaning that to be produced, they require a technology that uses a lot of labor and not so much capital. To understand why these two production possibility frontier have a different shape and have different quantities across countries, let's start from country A. Imagine that we were to produce only textiles in country A. Well, then this is a country in which we have not a lot of labor compared to capital, and textiles are exactly the good that is using labor intensely in production. The result is going to be that, at least compared to B, which has a lot of labor compared to capital, I can't produce too many textiles. That explains why the intercept of our production possibility frontier when we are producing zero soybeans is meeting at a lower point for A compared to B. Let's now switch to good S. Good S uses capital intensely, and A happens to be relatively abundant at capital. So it will produce when we're putting all the resources of the economy on producing S, then it's going to be true that the quantity produced in A of S must be greater than the quantity produced in A of T. I think that is a pretty intuitive concept. I have a lot of capital compared to labor. I'm putting it all into the production of soybeans that require a lot of capital. That gives me a certain level of production, and that in units should be bigger than the amount of textiles that I can get if I put all the resources of the economy into the technology for textiles. Why? Because the technology for textiles requires a lot of labor, but doesn't require a lot of capital. It happens to be true that my country is abundant in capital and not abundant in labor. So that's why the units of textiles that I can produce when I'm putting all the resources of the economy into textiles is lower than the amount of soybean that I can obtain. If we switch to B, the opposite is going to be true. B happens to have relatively more labor than capital compared to A. If they put all the resources in the economy in producing T, then they get a good deal because T uses intensely the resource in which they are abundant. And so they can produce a large quantity of T. If, on the other hand, they put all the resources in the economy in producing S, then the result will be different because S requires a lot of capital and B is not really abundant at capital, and so they will produce less unit than T if they put all the resources in the economy at producing S. Then we can just connect the dots and take into account that we have a production possibility frontier with increasing marginal cost to obtain both pictures.